Online history forums often highlight the Christ myth theory, the argument that Jesus of Nazareth was never a real person. Inside mainstream academia, however, this question was settled over a century ago. This consensus includes Christian, atheist, agnostic, and Jewish historians. Secular scholars like Bart Ehrman categorize the mythicist theory as a fringe position, unsupported by critical research. Denying his existence requires a departure from the standard methods used to conduct academic history. To evaluate the evidence, historians distinguish between two separate frameworks: the Christ of faith and the Jesus of history. The Christ of faith includes the supernatural claims of the New Testament, miracles, divine incarnation, and the resurrection. Because historical methodology cannot verify supernatural events, these elements are categorized as theology. This map shows the physical geography of the Jesus of history, a first-century Jewish preacher in the Herodian kingdom of Judea. Stripping away the theology allows historians to treat ancient texts as data sets to find a human profile. Skeptics of the historical Jesus often ask a seemingly obvious question: why aren't there more contemporary, first-hand written records of his life? Most of the Roman Empire was illiterate. Historical records were almost exclusively written by and for the tiny elite at the peak of the socioeconomic pyramid. An itinerant Galilean preacher occupied the bottom of this structure. The vast majority of people who lived in antiquity left no sign of their existence in the written record. Even prominent figures like Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect of Judea, are poorly documented. No eyewitness reports or contemporary written accounts of Pilate survive from his own lifetime. Expecting contemporary documentation for a poor ancient preacher overlooks the limitations of ancient record-keeping. When we plot the available evidence on a timeline starting from the crucifixion in the early 30s AD, the data begins to fill in. The earliest surviving texts, the epistles of Paul, were written in the late 40s AD. These fragile fragments show the physical reality of early documents that were circulated and meticulously copied across the Mediterranean. Paul recorded meeting Peter and Jesus' brother James around the year 36. Non-Christian sources also provide external data points for the historical record. In his work Antiquities of the Jews, the historian Flavius Josephus references Jesus and the execution of his brother James. Josephus was a military commander in Galilee who knew the region's geography and political leaders firsthand. Around 115 AD, the Roman senator Tacitus also recorded the origins of the movement. Tacitus noted that the founder, Christus, was executed during the governorship of Pontius Pilate. A network of 14 independent sources within a century makes a fabricated myth an outlier in the historical record. The question remains: how do historians identify objective data within texts that have a religious agenda? They apply the criteria of authenticity, specific filters designed to isolate historical bedrock. This diagram illustrates the criterion of multiple attestation, where separate, unconnected data streams converge to verify a single detail. If authors who never collaborated report the same core detail, it is highly probable the detail is rooted in history. Another tool is the criterion of embarrassment. Authors are unlikely to invent details that damage their cause or humiliate their hero. Applying this to the baptism of Jesus reveals a historical friction point. John's baptism was for the remission of sins. The early church had no theological reason to invent a scene where their Messiah was submissive to John. This bone shows the physical reality of crucifixion, the final point for the criterion of embarrassment. In the Roman world, crucifixion was a degrading punishment reserved for slaves and rebels. Claiming an executed criminal as a savior was a massive obstacle for gaining new converts. Historians accept these core truths precisely because they were awkward for the early church to explain. Once the surviving evidence is filtered through these methods, a clear result emerges. Stripping away the theology and miracles leaves a minimal historical profile. First, Jesus of Nazareth was baptized by John the Baptist. Second, he was executed by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. These two events are the primary data points for historical inquiry into his life. This brings us back to why the Christ myth theory remains on the fringes of scholarship. There is more evidence for Jesus than for almost any other non-elite figure in first-century Galilee. Modern archaeological excavations, like this site in Nazareth, corroborate the socio-economic context described in the texts. Applying mythicism standards to Jesus would require historians to erase most other figures from ancient history. The existence of Jesus is a data-driven conclusion, forming a baseline for historical literacy.